Thank you, Martin. What I'll try to do is, first of all, I think it's a great report. I think looking at the broader context in which the multilateral banks have to operate, and then what the needs are, global needs as they're emerging, and then seeing how the MDBs can be financed or increase their financing, and then looking at how MDBs in turn will finance countries. So I think the structure is great, and there's a lot of learning to be done in reading the report. What I'll try to do is that I'll try and present a sort of a country angle to what the new challenges are in climate finance, and then see when a country attempts to get climate finance, what kind of challenges it faces, and thereby what are some of the things that the MDBs can do to help countries address those challenges. So that's the way I will structure it. We did this paper in the spring before the catastrophe last August, and our focus was primarily on mitigation, and that comes from the fact that Pakistan contributes a very small share of the total greenhouse gases, but nevertheless ranks 27th because of its population, etc. And has very low GDP per capita. So one would expect that, a country with this profile would qualify for climate finance easily. Then we looked at Pakistan's own strategy for addressing mitigation. And we identified that there were basically three main pillars to that strategy. One was, and this was the largest, the strongest pillar, was to shift to solar. And that arose also because there's a great need to connect more and more households to electricity, and the cost of non-renewable sources of producing electricity were rising rapidly. So using solar was considered to be the central plank of the strategy. The second was a major drive for reforestation. It was called the 10 billion tree tsunami. It was launched, and nearly half the trees were sown. The funds ran out for the other half, and so the question was, can Pakistan access global climate finance to complete that objective? And finally, there is a widespread problem of crop burning, which has very severe health consequences. And therefore, switching to technologies of sowing, which will help reduce crop burning, and thereby improving the quality of air, but also reducing emissions, was a third plank of the strategy. So with this, and then of course, since the floods, you've got at least two other major planks. Pakistan was quite instrumental in helping create the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27, and then finally, complementary to that is the large-scale adaptation investments needed to rehabilitate the drainage systems, etc., so water doesn't stand for months and months after floods. So then these were the five, and the question was, when you go with this kind of a strategy to the world of climate finance, what kind of hope you can have for concessionary finance? So we looked at the fund that had been set up as a result of Paris Agreement, and we noticed that, it was a substantial additionality was provided 1920, and that contributed to the 1920 figure of $632 billion for climate finance, which was a substantial improvement on previous years. But of that, only 65 billion was concessionary, and it was largely given to middle-income countries in East Asia, and merely 20 billion were available um, for the poorer countries. So that didn't sound very promising. But most importantly, concessionary finance was not at all available for the central plank for Pakistan's strategy, which was to switch to solar, because it was felt that the market should operate well in switching to solar, and therefore a climate finance would not be the right window for that. Now, of course, accessing capital in the markets requires having in place all of what you need in terms of your risk assessment, etc., and the rates at which you can borrow in the international capital market makes it very prohibitive for many countries to enter that without reforming the basic structures of the economy to make it more attractive for private investors to come in. And then, of course, the multilateral banks have a huge role to play in that. They have been playing in the past, and that role will continue, especially using the guarantees more imaginatively, so that countries can be facilitated access to private finance in switching to solar. We looked at the second plank, which was the reforestation program, and we discovered that Belize had done a very successful debt swap. A conservation fund was available, and they were able to actually they were able to create additional fiscal space as a result of the debt swap, which allowed them to do the conservation that was necessary. And therefore, it was successful, and it was something that other countries could emulate. And we found that the reforestation program, half of which remains to be done, would be amenable to a debt swap arrangement. And again, I think the multilateral banks can help enormously in identifying potential debt swap opportunities, retiring, for example, fossil fuel burning power plants, etc. There's a number of large projects which can be phased out through debt swap arrangements, and that's again a skill and expertise and other risk reducing support that the banks can, the multilateral banks can provide to countries, low-income countries such as Pakistan. Similarly, we did a detailed assessment of the technologies that would be needed to reduce crop burning. The sums didn't turn out to be too large. We were somewhat surprised that MDBs were absent in that field. That is clearly, it's not just a question of mitigation, but it's also an issue concerning health. Would be related to to other development goals, and that's an area which is ripe for multilateral banks to come in to provide support. Now, coming to the post those awful floods, the loss and damage fund is a lot being talked about it. But if it operates anything like the fund that was created after the Paris Agreement, which had such stringent criteria for countries to qualify, then I think we'll need to do a lot of rethinking on how uh, that fund can be operationalized so that countries can actually benefit from it. The initial assessment of losses to Pakistan are about 35, $38 billion. So the the big recommendation of increasing um, finances available to the multilateral development banks is the right one. I've seen numbers of something like $250 billion a year additional. So given Pakistan's experience, those kinds of funding make a lot of sense. But again, what's important is operationalizing those funds in a way that makes it somewhat more feasible to access them. There's going to remain a very important um, dimension of adaptation investments, making sure that the drainage systems, if the floods do happen, if this is a recurrent pattern, the drainage systems will need to be fixed. We know that the old drains that the natural drainage system of this area had been encroached upon by farmland, by urban expansion of urban centers, and therefore, because such events were not expected in that part of the country, but clearly the weather patterns have shifted, and so rehabilitating that will be very important. That's very much up the alley of multilateral development banks. Those kinds of investments they know well how to do. Just that the scale of the investments needed will be huge, and therefore, again, making adequate funding available to the multilateral development banks will be critical. So what I've tried to do is to give very specific examples of the kinds of challenges that are faced by a country like Pakistan, and what are some of the central planks of the strategies to meet those challenges, and in realizing those strategies, the banks, the multilateral development banks will need to do the kind of reform that's been recommended in this report, and other work that I've seen, which is very complementary to the report put out by the OECD. Let me stop there.